All right, we're back with a very special edition. We are talking about Music in the 80s, an amazing book by the one and only photographer, creative director extraordinaire, Lynn Goldsmith. Hey, Lynn.
Hey, how you doing?
Oh, doing so great. What an amazing book. I mean, loving music like I do, loving history and just the greats. There's nothing better than a beautiful coffee table book and be able to look at spectacular photographs. As long as you want to look at them. It's one thing, it's on a screen and boom, it's there, it's gone, but a beautiful book like this, you can really kick back, have your drink, your smoke, whatever you're doing, and just really get lost in the music. And what an era, the 80s was so important. I was born in the late 50s, grew up in the 60s, but I always say the 70s was like the most amazing decade for so many foundational groups that really established the blueprint. But like we talked before, the 80s was now early 81. You had this thing called MTV, music television, and artists that probably never would have stood a chance of fitting in the regimented formats of radio are now, boom, they're in everybody's bedrooms and living rooms across America. Talk about, you coming up, and doing so much great work in the 70s. How that changed for you? How did the advent of MTV and the explosion of these new artists affect your work?
Um, well, it didn't really affect my photography. It affected my desire to make an album as a recording artist under the name Will Powers, because I felt that what I could do in terms of electronic music had a place now, and that MTV, which basically was a vehicle for videos to serve to sell an artist's record, that for me it was exciting because I thought I could make something that went beyond just an album where the music was interpreted in videos, not really as a commercial for the song, but as to enhance the song. And so I called myself an optic music artist. And actually, one of my songs, Smile, will be on the new Sex and the City, which airs on the 13th. And then also tomorrow, Airmail magazine, which is online. It's Graydon Carter from Vanity Fair, his publication. They've done a big piece on Will Powers. So even though I recorded it in the 80s, it seems like the 80s are back now, as far in terms of being a subject of popularity. And Will Powers was part of that. So, as far as my photography and what's in the book, Music in the 80s, there's quotes from all different generations of people. And just like you feel that the 70s was like the time for you, more powerful than any other decade. Sorry about that. Sorry, one sec. I don't know how to turn this thing off. More powerful than any other decade. I think, I'm older than you, and for me, it was the 60s. And that's also true for Iggy Pop and Chris and Debbie and a number of people who gave quotes. And then there's people who are more of your generation, which would be Bono, who have quotes about the 80s. And then there are people who were even younger than Bono, like Ben Stiller. And there's quotes in there because I found it fascinating that people of my generation really had a very negative attitude about the 80s. It was the time of what they considered to be bad fashion with, women had big shoulder pads, and that was the era as well of the true beginnings of hair metal, big metal. That was before death metal. So there were all the hair bands. And I thought, when I really looked at my body of work of the 80s, I realized it was probably the greatest decade in music, because so many diverse kinds of genres and artists all had popularity, whether it was Barry Manilow or Bananarama. And people were just as diverse in how they dressed, in terms of the kind of music that they played. I don't know if various artists from other countries, like Duran Duran, and others, could have had the quick rise to stardom had it not been for MTV really getting it out there and spreading that visual of them. So it was really an opportunity for all different kinds of music to be successful, to be heard, and to be on the charts. Herbie Hancock was on the charts, and that's a jazz artist. Wynton Marsalis, as well as the Allman Brothers, as well as Susie Sue and the Banshees. And that was an era where I think reggae, which had, really come out in the 70s, but it had its big push in the 80s with the success of Bob Marley's songs. Other groups like the Police turned it into a kind of like a new form of reggae. And then there were people who stuck with the soul aspect, but added a dance element to it, like George Clinton and like Ashford and Simpson. That was also the era of the Commodores, who had a comeback, as did Tina Turner. So, it was overall, when I looked at the large range of artists, that's what I wanted to show in the book, Music in the 80s, and get quotes from all different generations to see how really, when we're any age from 12 to 18, we tend to find that decade to be our music. But really, the 80s had something for everybody.
Yeah, when I mentioned the 70s being such a great time, I'm thinking musically, but visually, there's no question the 80s exploded, not only with music television, but with so many colorful artists. And I know it was a time of introduction of new artists, to the world, and the reinvention. I think so many artists that were popular in the 70s had to try and figure out, like, okay, how am I going to compete in this new music television thing? I've sold all these records, made all these hits without, a focus on videos. Now, how do I, adapt myself with so many thousands of photographs taken? How did you decide which ones went in the book?
Well, it was hard. So part of it was that I wanted to show how different artists were. So I decided to do it alphabetically. And then one could see, like I mentioned before, Bananarama next to Barry Manilow, and you could easily see the fashion difference, much less the musical difference. And so I did an A to Z. However, there were a number of groups that I photographed that I left out, like Aha, which is the Norway's claim to fame as, the only global hit they ever hit group, musical group that really came out of there. And that was made possible in part because of MTV. But they had, a really big song, and they're not in the book. There's a lot of people that I photographed, but and the book is really quite heavy. It must weigh at least 5 pounds. You can use it for like lifting weights. And I think that, I tried to cover different areas, but there were a number of artists who I wished I could have put in there. And I just didn't have enough pages.
Yeah, it is a labor of love, no question about it. And yeah, I think I'm going to do some curling exercises with the book. It is very bulky, very substantial, and takes you down the road. And I know, like I say, we no longer have MTV as we know it. So many things have changed. We don't have the record store experience like we used to. We don't have freeform radio like we had. Everything is, technologically, gone in these different directions, some great, some not so great. I think it's harder than ever for a new artist to break. But what you've captured is definitely a time and space of just so much incredible growth in music and explosion. It's, I call it the new British invasion. You had all those explosion of the Boy Georges and the Duran Durans and the all these haircut 100s and all the level 42s. You had all this new stuff coming out of Britain that it seemed like it was another wave of the British invasion.
Well, but you also had, artists who had worked in the 70s quite a bit, and that, it was like people in the know knew about them, but they didn't really have hits until the 80s. Like, for example, Joan Jett, with Crimson and Clover. So, and I don't think Blondie really took off to be a big group until the 80s. So people used to work for years, and those who came out in the 70s, even Springsteen, it was in the 80s that he had Dancing in the Dark and really started, had his a hit single. Before that, he didn't. So, the fact that new musical genres really became successful in terms of charting, like rap music. There were rappers in the late 70s, but it wasn't until the 80s when artists, like Run DMC had hits, and they influenced the Beastie Boys. So that was really kind of like the first awareness of a white rap group. And, the fact that that was a whole new kind of music, which was charting. In addition to that, you had, other artists that might not be household names today, but they were very big, like Phyllis Hyman, Angela Bofill. So there were those people that had hits for maybe a couple of years during that time. And then for whatever reason, they just kind of disappeared.